Well, it's hot, and that means that I got even a bigger, hurdle here to keep you guys awake and moving. I feel like this is more like an African service than a Seattle service. But anyway, it wasn't necessarily my intention to end up being the person to give the sermon and the sermon. So you have to talk to Mr. Slocum about that. You get to hear from me twice in a day. I hope it's okay. Just tell me, I don't know. Just let me know. I have an important topic I want to share with you, though. It came to mind from the French language service last Sabbath, where Mr. Ray Clore gave a sermon about prayer. And I guess I'll start by asking you a question, try and keep you awake. If Jesus Christ told you to pray about something, would you do it? Now, you might be looking at me thinking, well, that's kind of a silly question. Of course, I'm here. I'm in this congregation. It's hot. I'm here. I made the trip. Of course, I would pray about what Jesus Christ told me to pray about. And yet, there is a command to pray about something that I have been remiss on, and it was pointed out to me by Mr. Clore, to all of us who were listening. And it really got me thinking about this topic. And I'd like to ask you to turn with me to Matthew 24. And we're going to read verses 15 to 20, and we're going to see a command to pray about something, and you'll have to ask yourself whether you're praying about this, because I'm telling you I wasn't, and I realized I should have been, and I'm now working to incorporate this into my regular prayer routine. So Matthew 24, verses 15 to 20, we want to start in verse 15 because we want to get some of the context to this. Matthew 24, verse 15 to 20, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," whoever reads, let him understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those with nursing babies in those days." Verse 20, and here's the command, "And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath." So when's the last time you included that prayer in your routine? God, I pray that when the time comes for me to flee, when the time comes for me and my family to flee, that it would not be in winter and it would not be on the Sabbath. Well, I'm telling you, I don't know if I ever prayed that. Maybe I should have. Maybe some of you are like, well, you must have missed something, Tim, because we've talked about that before. Maybe you'd say that, but that didn't come to my mind. And it really opens the door to all sorts of interesting sort of perspectives on what Jesus is attempting to get across to his disciples in this command. And so today I want to talk about how we can understand this verse and what we're really supposed to be praying about so that we can incorporate this tonight and tomorrow and ongoing into our prayers, that we would not forget to pray about this. And if we're going to pray about this, I think we need to understand what it's talking about. What exactly are we praying about? What is the context here? First of all, we have to ask the question, does this prayer even apply to us? Or is it talking about past events that aren't relevant to us today? And if we're going somewhere, where are we going? And why is leaving on a Wednesday versus a Saturday so important that Jesus would call this out? What is the significance of the Sabbath in this context, both for us and for others? And in the past, the church talked a lot about fleeing, and we use this term, the place of safety. You can go online and you can look up place of safety on ucg.org and see some different sermons about that. I don't think we talk as much about fleeing as we used to. Indeed, it may seem anachronistic. It's kind of out of time because, now with Google Earth, you can zoom in anywhere on the earth, right? You got surface-to-surface missile technology. There's no safe place. There's photographs being taken of everything. I'm sure that probably somewhere in some room in the Pentagon, they're looking at the license plates in our parking lot, right? There's no safe place. So what does it mean, place of safety? And what does it mean to flee? And so we don't really talk about that. But this verse, it confronts us with a different reality. We can't just wave our hands at it and say, well, fleeing I might stay in my house. Well, we're going to look at this because if this is really for us, which I think we're going to see it is, then there's a point A and there's a point B. We don't know where the A and the B is in terms of where we're coming from and where we're going to, but we're going someplace, and we can't just wave our hands at it. We have to ask ourselves, am I really going to flee? And if I'm going to flee, does it matter that I flee on a Wednesday versus a Saturday? And does it matter that it's in July or it's in January? We have to look at this verse and really ask this, are we going to take this seriously? Do we understand what it's actually telling us? The title of today's message is The End Time Prayer. Because I think that's what we're talking about, the end time prayer. And we're going to cover 3 points. First of all, is this prayer commanded for us today? I think we need to get theologically grounded in that. Where are people fleeing from and to? And what is the significance of Matthew mentioning the Sabbath? Where does that fit in? Because there are parallel accounts of this in Luke 21 and Mark 13, and they don't mention the Sabbath. Only Matthew mentions the Sabbath. They mention winter, but not the Sabbath. So let's get into this. Is prayer commanded? Is this prayer commanded for us today, or was it just for those people who were listening at the time? So the implication of this question is whether the context of this verse is describing a past event, specifically the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So let's get a bit more context to what we're reading to kind of dig into this. If you just turn one page back or skip back a few verses to Matthew 24, verse 1 to 3, let's see how this conversation is set up. The famous Olivet Prophecy. Matthew 24, verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." And in verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So the context of this scripture in verse 20, this one that we're examining today, is clearly about the end of the age. That's the context. And it's about Christ's return, and we'll come back to that later. And then in verses 4 to 13, Jesus outlines a series of events which the disciples can look to as signs that they can anticipate of Jesus' return. And in verse 14, it culminates in this passage, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." And growing up, I heard this scripture a lot. Herbert Armstrong talked about this scripture a lot. This is a prophecy. It's a fact. It's going to happen, and we're a part of it. That's why I spent the time talking about what we're doing in the French language, because this work is a worldwide work. It's a Portuguese and a Spanish and a French and an English and a Swahili and so forth and so on work to all peoples. And so then we've read verses 15 to 20. So let's pick up the context in verse 21 then. "For then," after we are to pray that our flight would not be in the winter on Sabbath, it says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world, until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." And then in verse 29, skipping down, it says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. That is almost word for word from Daniel 7. Almost word for word, a prophecy of the Son of Man coming before the Ancient of Days, coming in the clouds of heaven with power or authority, Daniel says, and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So I think your homework, if you decide to do homework, is to read the rest of Matthew 24 and 25 to kind of see where this fits in as you're thinking about this subject and how verse 20 applies to you. I think this gives us enough to work on here for the sermon today. So history tells us that in AD 66, there was what was called the First Jewish Revolt. So the Jews rose up and they kicked the Romans out of Judea, kicked them out of Jerusalem, which started a whole series of events. The Romans attempted to retake Jerusalem, but they were spread too thin, and they had to pull back. And so for a period of time, the Jews had the opportunity to have their own nation again. And for several years, they did. But eventually, Roman Emperor Nero dispatched a second army under Vespasian and his son Titus, and they eventually conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD, a very famous story which I'm sure you've read about or heard about. And over the centuries, as scholars have read Matthew 24 and parallel accounts in Luke 21 and Mark 13, they concluded that many parts of this story in these synoptic gospel accounts could have been fulfilled by the events of AD 66 to AD 70. And there's a lot of scholarship on this question. Books and books and books and books written about the meaning of Matthew 24. Is it first century? Is it apocalyptic? What is it? How does it fit? And there is great disagreement. There are so many different theories. I'm only going to go through 4 today. But there is great disagreement about how to think about the time frame of these of this writing. So, if you're taking some notes, this is the first school of thought, and I disagree with this. And this is not the teaching of the church, but as I've shared before, it's good to know the questions as much as it is to know the answers. So, this is the first school of thought on what Matthew 24 means. It says that the entirety of the discussion of Matthew 24 speaks to the sacking and destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's the first school of thought, that all of these events, and interestingly, if you look at Luke 21, again, if you want to take that as homework, and you look at Mark 13, those descriptions feel much more contemporary to first century. They feel like they're really describing something that would happen there with Rome in 70 AD. So this line of reasoning says that all of these accounts are intended to foretell events that related to the fall of Jerusalem by the Romans. And some go as far, who are part of the school of thinking, some go as far to say that these accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written after the fall of Jerusalem. And so because they were written after, they would know kind of how to describe it, which is why it kind of feels like it relates to 70 AD. So under this theory, the command in verse 20 to pray that our flight would not be in winter or Sabbath was a command only for the people at the time and wouldn't be applicable for us today. Okay, so that's one school of thought. And in fact, you can find a very famous organization that we used to be a part of that changed its name that believes this. Under this theory, as I said, it wouldn't be for us. The problem with this theory, frankly, they're too numerous to count. So I don't have the time, and you'd fall asleep, and I'm trying to keep you going here. So I'm just going to give you a few of the flaws. First, we've already read in verse 3 that the whole context is the end time. And we read enough to see that it talks about the Son of Man coming in the clouds. I don't know if you realize, but that didn't happen in 70 AD. I think we know that. So it's very flawed. Also, even very reputable scholars, in fact, a significant number of scholars, argue that the description of the fall here of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 isn't detailed enough to actually be a description that was written afterwards. If it was written afterwards, it would be a little bit more detailed, a little bit more on point. And so there's actually a lot of scholarship to say that, no, this wasn't written after. This was actually written before. There's not enough specifics in there. Verse 37 talks about the Son of Man. Verse 22 says no one would be saved except for the elect's sake. And yet it is pretty well understood that the Christians fled Jerusalem in AD 66 after the first Jewish revolt and weren't there for the fall of Jerusalem. And so they weren't there to save the city. And by the way, the city wasn't saved anyway. So it just, nothing really sort of makes sense with this theory. And so in my view, and in the view of many, it just doesn't hold water. And it's not the teaching of the church. Okay, the second theory, a school of thought in Matthew 24, is that the entire discussion relates to the second coming of Jesus Christ and has nothing to do with the sacking of Jerusalem in AD 70. So the problem with this theory is that the parallel accounts in Luke and Mark are, like I said, are a little more specific about some of the references. And it's hard to imagine the early church reading this in 72, 75, 80 AD, or even in 66 or 67, couldn't have imagined that this would be something they needed to be prepared for or something that happened. And so it's a little bit problematic in terms of a theory. It's a possibility. I guess what I would say is it's probably not the best answer. You ever got that multiple choice? Like, oh, that's an answer, but it's not the best answer. You can have a better answer than that. A third school of thought says that there is either a portion of Matthew 24 that relates to the fall of Rome and a portion that relates to the end time, or there's a patchwork quilt of verses. So like verse 7 is Rome, and verse 8 is the end time, and verse 10 is Rome, and verse 15 is the end time. And this gets very problematic because nobody can agree on what verses apply to what things. So some people might say, well, verse 20 about prayer, oh, that relates to Rome. But verse 22 about the elect's sake, oh, that relates to the end time. And so this theory has a lot of holes in it. But again, it is a school of thought that you have to kind of parse the chapter to figure out what applies to what. Another theory, and again, I'm just going to give you 4, is that the fall of Jerusalem is a type of fulfillment of Christ's return when Jerusalem will be conquered again, and will have and it sort of it foreshadows that time. And the Church of God has consistently taught along these lines for many years. There's a term you've probably heard of called duality, the duality of prophecy. And so there is this school of thought, and it's not just us in the Church of God who have this school of thought. This is a mainstream scholarly view that there is a foreshadowing going on, that Christ is giving an indication of something that's going to happen presently and something that will happen in the future. Our view on that and the scholars that go to that, we'll go to Matthew 17 as an example. So go with me to Matthew 17. Again, you don't have to turn, if you don't have a lot of energy, it's not a lot of pages to turn, just a couple pages back and you can do it. Matthew 17, verse 10 and to 13, we see an example where Jesus speaks in this duality. He speaks in this foreshadowing way. It says in Matthew 17, verse 10, and his disciples asked him, saying, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And then Jesus answered and said to them, Elijah truly is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already. And they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands. And so Jesus himself is giving a duality here. He's talking about the fact that John came and he was a type of Elijah, but at this point, John was dead. And now he's talking about another Elijah that's going to come that will be the Elijah that will proclaim his second coming. And so Jesus does this in chapter 17. So the view is he's doing it in chapter 24. He's foreshadowing. He's talking about an event that is really going to happen as well as a future event after that. And so we today and the Church of God teach. And like I said, I think you could say it's entirely about the end of the age, but I think that's probably not the best answer. I think the duality is a better answer. We understand today that we are imperiled. And we can read a lot of the events in Matthew 24, and we can see some of those things happening today. At least we should be able to see some of those things happening today if we're looking at it. You probably know this, but you know the name of the Russian missile that's aimed at us, right? People know that? Anybody know that? I'm not asking you if you've heard that name. It's called Satan. Yeah. Look it up. Yeah. So Russia decided to name their missile Satan in the 60s or 70s. So the current missiles that can be launched from anywhere in Russia and hit any city on the planet, they actually, I think I wrote it down here somewhere. Oh yeah, 220 tons. Kind of a big missile. It's named Satan II. It's kind of a better version of the original. And we know the doomsday clock is the closest it's ever been to midnight. We were literally talking about the threat of nuclear war just a few months ago. With everything that's going on in the news cycles, we sometimes forget about that, but that could come up tomorrow. And the French service in February, the French were talking about it a lot because the scenario we were talking about in the French service after church was that the nuclear warhead would hit somewhere in Ukraine, and then the wind would blow it straight across, right onto France. If you superimpose a map of the United States onto Europe, you'll see that Seattle's about where Portugal is, and Moscow is about where Maine is. Okay, so that's kind of the size we're talking about. So you drop a nuclear warhead on Kyiv or Kherson or any of these places, tactical, I think they're called now, and you're going to get that fallout just blow right across, just like if a missile hit in Utah or in Montana, we would get the nuclear fallout. And they've already got stats that show the rates of cancer from the nuclear fallout in Chernobyl across Northern Europe are significantly elevated, and they tie that directly to the nuclear fallout in Chernobyl. So in Europe, people are really thinking about this, and we should be thinking about this as well. The book of Matthew here tells us that we better be praying that our flight would not be in winter or on the Sabbath. It's real, it's for us, it's a duality. It was for them and for us. So I think the best answer to my first question is this for us or somebody else? I think the best answer is it's for both. It was for them, and it's for us, and we better be paying attention. So we get to our second question, which is, where are these people fleeing to or from? And that's the question we always want to ask. We tend to go to that question. We've gone to that question. Where are we going? The Greek word here, if we go back to Matthew 24, the Greek word in verse 16 is the word fuego, which means a sudden fleeing. Matthew 24, verse 16, it says, then let those who are in the mountains flee. And then in verse 20, it says flight. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter. So this word, when you see or read this word, think about being on a plane and listening to the safety briefing. And in the safety briefing, they say, in the event of an emergency landing, don't get your stuff. Just get out of the plane. That's the sense of this word in flee. And we read that in verse 15 and 16 and 17. You don't have a chance to go downstairs. You don't have a chance to go back to the house. Now, I think Jesus is trying to get across something to us here. But the point is, maybe we have an hour. Maybe we have an afternoon. Maybe we have overnight. If you had 4 hours to decide what you were going to take with you, and all you could take was something you could carry, what would you take? That's the kind of discussion. And, that feels weird to talk about now. It almost, like I said, it almost feels like something we talk about in the past. And I think that's because this discussion has been so abused by unscrupulous con men and people who want to create scare tactics. And generally, it's just to get money. And they want to predict when it's going to happen, and they want to tell us where it's going to be, and they want to tell us to, pack our bag and what we should have in our bag, and they want to just whip people into kind of a frenzy of fear. Well, that's not how it should be. This is a discussion that says we have to be ready. We don't need to be fearful. We don't need to put our lives on hold for this. This is integrated into who we are. This is integrated into who we are. Look over to Revelation 12, verse 6. And I wanted to mention that because sometimes messages like these get kind of lumped in with some of those others. What I'm talking about today, and I hope what you're getting from this, is a very clear-eyed, very rational look at a command to pray and how to think about that today. Revelation 12, verse 6, very famous passage. It said, "Then the woman fled into the wilderness." The woman is a picture of the church in this case, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So there's a place, there's a location, and there's a group of people identified in verse 6. Notice verse 13. Revelation 12, verse 13. "Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child." Verse 14, "But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent." Now, we know from Exodus 19, you can make that note, 19 verse 4, Exodus 19 verse 4, that Israel was born on eagle's wings. And in fact, they walked. So we don't need to get too hung up on the whole jet airplane thing. The point here is not the mode of transportation. The point is the way in which we are protected as we are transported or as we move from one place to another. And that there is still a place. Now, in this was given, is nourished, in verse 6, it actually makes reference to a place. And some have said, well, that's a place, singular. It's a singular geographic place. But it might be, or it might not be. Are we all going to be together? Are the Africans, the Europeans, those in Latin America and Europe, are we all going to be in the same place? And we don't know. This verse might argue for a single place because it seems to be a single place that's referenced. But it can also be a place in terms of an idea. It is a place. We have a place of safety. We have a place of refuge. We have a place where we are nourished. If you go back to Matthew 24 and look in verse 31, we read that earlier. This would argue for multiple places. Matthew 24, verse 31, where it talks about he's going to gather together the elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So this would argue that maybe here in the Northwest we'll be in a different place than the people in the Congo, or we'll be in a different place than people in Argentina. We really don't know. I like the way Robin Weber puts this. He's got a nice sermon on the place of safety if you want to look that up. He says, you're not going to find this on your GPS. Right? Don't start looking for this on your GPS right now. It's not fruitful. Frankly, I think it's enough. I think it's enough to know that it's going to happen and that we need to plan for it. Because if you think about it, if we're going to flee, if we've established, in my first point, that Matthew 24 is applicable to us, if we've established that Matthew 24, verse 20 is a prayer for us, then that means that we're going to flee. And to flee means that you have a point A and you have a point B. Now, you might have a point C or D or whatever, but the point is you at least have 2 points. So wherever we are, we can't stay there. We have to go someplace else. And I think that's probably all we need to know right now, because that's just a mental shift in our thinking that we have to make, that we may not be where we think we're going to be when all these things happen. We might be someplace else. And as I said, unfortunately, many many people have misused and frankly abused some of these scriptures. And because of that, we may tend to shy away from these kinds of prophetic discussions, to stand up and say, we're going to flee. It sounds maybe kooky, in a context outside of this, but that's what it says. And guess what? If you lived in Ukraine in February, you probably fled. It happens. It happens. It happens on a small scale like Ukraine, where they've now integrated it into Europe. And when I was there in Belgium in May, we talked about that. We talked about how the European Union has given all Ukrainian citizens the right to work anywhere in Europe while this war is going on. So they just absorb millions of people. So fleeing is a reality. It exists, and we need to get our minds around that. And in any case, who wants to live trapped in materialism? I mean, even academically, I think the world understands this. If our meaning comes from things, it's kind of sad. Oh, I don't want to leave my house, my career, my this, my that. I mean, even the world understands this academically, that our lives have to have greater meaning than just the things we have around us. We have to attach meaning to things that are more meaningful than that. All right, that brings me to the final question, final point, if you're still with me here in the heat. What is the significance of Matthew mentioning the Sabbath? How does that fit into this verse? If we know it applies to us, and we know that there's going to be a flight, a flee, a fuego, a sudden, and we have to go to some place where we're not right now, what does this mean? Now, the Church of God has historically taught that the word Sabbath here, or the concept of the Sabbath being mentioned, means that the Sabbath will still be relevant for true believers at the end of the age. I don't know if you've mentioned this to some of your friends who might be interested in what your beliefs are and why we keep the Sabbath, because this is actually an interesting point. The church has historically taught this. This means the Sabbath observance will be in place by Christ's believers, or believers in Christ. So let's examine this point critically. Let's make sure we're grounded in this point to understand why that is or why that is not. So I'm going to read to you from Expositor's Bible Commentary. This is their commentary on Matthew 24, verse 20, about your flight being in winter on the Sabbath. It's taken from page 501, volume 8. If you happen to have it or you look it up, it's actually a really good commentary. This is what they have to say about Matthew 24, verse 20. Flight is obviously harder in winter. As for fleeing on the Sabbath, travel would become more difficult because few would help, and many would try to prevent traveling farther than a Sabbath day journey. So the comment from the Expositor's Bible Commentary is not the teaching of the church, but rather it represents really the mainstream Protestant explanation for this verse. The mainstream Protestant teaching goes something like this. The reason Christians are to pray, and again, some, in fact, many do believe Matthew 24, verse 20 is a current, applicable to them verse within mainstream Protestant denominations, so they're not unlike us in that way. But they would say that the reason Christians are to pray that they don't flee on the Sabbath, as it says, is because of Sabbath restrictions imposed by the Jews. The Jews, who are strictly keeping the Sabbath, would impose restrictions on true believers such that they couldn't travel farther than a certain distance, and therefore they would be trapped and unable to flee. That the gates of Jerusalem would be closed on the Sabbath, and therefore they could not escape. That they would look down on those people who would flee and would not help them because it's the day of rest for the Jews, and therefore they would not be available to true believers to help them flee. That is the mainstream Protestant view of what this passage means. I hope that you can see the huge gaping, obvious flaws in this argument. I hope you just kind of wrap your brain around that thought. So first, this argument only works if one believes the entire chapter or certain selective verses relate to the Roman conquest of 70 AD. That's why I went through those 4 schools of thought earlier. So it only works unless you take yourself out of today and you put yourself into 70 AD. On the other hand, if one believes that all of Matthew 24 relates to the end of the age, and there is a duality or foreshadowing, as we've talked about is the teaching of the church, and frankly, literally millions of Protestants meeting in churches all over the world, it's hard to imagine that Christians from all over the world at the end time are suddenly going to be stopped by religiously strict Jews. Let's say in Kinshasa. Okay, so we've got true believers in Kinshasa, and it's time to flee, and suddenly these religiously strict Jews are going to come out of nowhere and stop them from fleeing. Now, I'm going to tell you, it's hard to find a Jewish person in Kinshasa, let alone religiously strict Jews. It doesn't hold together. There really aren't enough religiously strict Jews stationed all over the world that would somehow impede people from fleeing. And even then, that argument is flawed because, and you probably heard this, but there's a significant school of thought, even within the first century Judaism, that it is okay to break one of God's laws if life is involved. So, and there's this whole debate, is it okay to break a law if somebody's going to die? And so even within Judaism, if somebody is fleeing for their lives, let's say imagine you're in Ukraine and you're fleeing from your life, and the Jew says, no, I know we've got bombs dropping, but it's the Sabbath, so we got to stay put. It doesn't work that way in Judaism. Even within Judaism, they say, our lives are in danger, we must flee. So it also doesn't sort of hang together from that angle. So the much simpler answer, people probably heard of Occam's razor, right? This famous Franciscan from the Middle Ages. He said the simplest answer is basically the answer. The simplest answer is that the Sabbath was kept then, and the Sabbath is going to be kept at the end of the age, and nobody wants to flee on the Sabbath. Do you want to flee on the Sabbath? See, Friday night, we should be winding down, right? We've wound down our activities, sun setting, maybe late, maybe early, depending, and we're getting into a different frame of mind. And that frame of mind is not to probably start out in one of the most significant life events any of us are ever going to face, which is leaving everything we have and going someplace else. Imagine, you're kind of in that mode. You went to sleep Friday night. You're really thankful for the Sabbath. You're sleeping in Saturday morning. You're looking forward. No alarm clock. I'm getting up at 10 o'clock. And then suddenly 4 a.m., right? The phone rings. Somebody knocks at the door. We got to go. You got 2 hours. The bus is coming. That's not how you want to spend a Sabbath. You want to spend your Sabbath doing something else and not that. That's frankly just the simplest explanation. We want to call the Sabbath a delight, and fleeing for our lives is not a delight. It doesn't fit with how God designed the Sabbath and how he made it for us. We want to have that day of rest. I don't know if you've had this situation where something happened and you didn't get a Sabbath. That's happened to me sometimes. Something happened, and I get to sort of that Wednesday or Thursday of that week, and I'm exhausted. It's like I missed my Sabbath. I didn't get my rest, and I feel myself being cranky, and I'm not kind of where I need to be. And God wants us to have our rest. About 5 years ago, my wife and I undertook an addition to our house, 750 square foot addition, and we did a whole house remodel at the time, and we lived in a 23-foot trailer in our driveway for 9 months. Anybody done a remodel to their house? Few? Is it stressful? Very stressful. It's very, very stressful. And when you're under stress like that, sometimes the decisions that you make can be a lot harder. That's okay. She'll find her way. Now imagine, put an exponent of 10 or 100 on top of the stress, whatever stressful event you've been through, and put, multiply by 10, multiply by 100. That's what this is going to be like. It's going to be stressful. I dare say we're going to have arguments. Imagine husband and wife agreeing on what you're going to take in 2 hours. Imagine with your kids, right? Your kids are like, well, Dad, I got to take this. Well, we don't have space. Well, Susie gets to take this. I mean, arguments among the kids, arguments in the family. Your brother's calling you like, okay, well, I'll bring this and you bring that. I mean, this is stress. And think about what we just went through. God willing, we just finished the COVID pandemic, hopefully. What kind of stress did that put on the church, right? Masks, vaccines, all this stuff. Huge stress on us. Imagine coming into the end of the age and all these things are happening and we wonder what's next. And then suddenly the time comes, we might be kind of biting each other's heads off. We got to be careful about that. That's going to be a lot of stress on us. And you don't want to have to do that when it's rainy and cold and it's 3 a.m. on a Sabbath morning and you thought you were going to sleep in. And this is likely just the simplest explanation. We don't have to come up with other sort of complicated things out there. So I hope this has been helpful, that it's for us. We're going from point A to point B. We don't know the point A and we don't know the point B, but that's enough. And we better be ready, and we better hope that it doesn't happen at a time when we're not ready, like a Sabbath morning when we're sort of just chilling, or in a winter scenario when we're putting our stuff in the car and now it's all wet, or it's cold and we don't have, imagine if you're older and you're on medication and it's 32 degrees outside and you got to get going. This is what Jesus is talking about. And I hope that we can incorporate this prayer into our regular routine, that this is something that's going to happen, it's real, and we can't just dismiss it as something we used to talk about or something that con men use to kind of whip up fear. It's real, it's clear-eyed, it's rational, and it's something that Jesus asked us to pray about.